In the pantheon of Old West figures, few shine with the mythical intensity of Calamity Jane. She was immortalized not just as a woman in a man's world, but as a force of nature who outmatched the toughest among them. The image crafted for the public was that of a woman who traded her corset for buckskin pants, her embroidery for a Colt revolver, and submission for fierce independence. She represented the personification of frontier freedom, a wild and untamable woman who rode, drank, and shot with a skill that supposedly put her male contemporaries to shame. This iconic figure became a powerful symbol, a fantasy of female empowerment in a rigidly patriarchal era, capturing the imagination of a nation fascinated by the brutality and romance of its unexplored lands. The legend of her skills was extraordinarily detailed. The stories, popularized across the country, depicted her as an elite scout for the United States Army, serving under renowned generals like George Custer and George Crook. In these tales, she was not merely a participant but a key player in crucial military campaigns, guiding soldiers through dangerous and hostile territories with an unparalleled knowledge of the land. Her fame as an expert sharpshooter was equally legendary. It was said she could hit a distant target from horseback, defend stagecoaches from attacks, and engage in gunfights without ever flinching. These feats, though never verified, formed the backbone of her myth, painting her as a hardened warrior and a natural survivor. The emotional pillar that supported much of her legend was her supposed tragic romance with the famous gunman Wild Bill Hickok. The popular narrative portrayed them as Old West soulmates, a couple bound by deep love and mutual respect. The story reached its dramatic climax with Hickok's murder in Deadwood. Driven by overwhelming grief and a desire for revenge, the Calamity Jane of legend allegedly hunted down his killer, Jack McCall, relentlessly to bring him to justice. This act of loving retribution solidified her image as a loyal and tragic heroine whose heart was as true as her aim. Her expressed wish to be buried next to him served as the perfect epilogue to this epic frontier love story. This grandiose image did not emerge from a vacuum. It was meticulously crafted and disseminated by the dime novels, the cheap and sensationalist fiction that was the 19th century equivalent of pop culture. Writers from the American East, eager for heroes and villains for their adventure stories, found in Martha Jane Canary the perfect blank canvas. They took fragments of her life and exaggerated them to epic proportions, transforming a frontier woman into a superhero. Calamity Jane became a brand-name character, a figure who sold countless issues with her fictional exploits. She herself, realizing the value of her notoriety, eventually embraced and perpetuated these stories, forever blurring the line between the woman she was and the legend she became. Far from the image of a heroine born for adventure, the real life of Martha Jane Canary began under the sign of poverty and instability. Born around 1852 in Missouri, she was the eldest of 6 children to parents who lived on the fringes of society, constantly searching for a fortune they never found. Her childhood was not spent in army training camps or learning to shoot with precision, but rather inside a covered wagon, crossing the country in an incessant and unsuccessful migration. The Canary family was driven by the promise of gold and a better life, but each new stop brought only more manual labor, debt, and hopelessness. Martha learned from an early age that survival was a daily struggle, a brutal lesson that violently contrasted with the freedom and heroism of her future legend. The transition from childhood to adolescence was marked by a relentless tragedy that thrust her into an adult world for which she was unprepared. Around the age of 12, while the family was on the trail to Montana, her mother died of pneumonia. Shortly thereafter, her father took the children to Utah and essentially abandoned them, dying soon after himself. Suddenly, a penniless teenage orphan found herself solely responsible for her 5 younger siblings. This crushing responsibility forced Martha to take any kind of work, not out of a desire for adventure, but out of the sheer necessity to feed the children who depended on her. The figure of the young head of the household, fighting to keep her siblings together, is a much darker and more poignant image than that of the carefree lone scout from the dime novels. Without a formal education or a support network, Martha's options were extremely limited and often degrading. She wandered from town to town, camp to camp, taking on the lowest paying and most menial jobs available on the frontier. She was a laundress, a cook, a waitress, a dance hall girl, and a courting. To many historians and contemporary accounts, she occasionally turned to prostitution to survive. It was a precarious existence, lived among soldiers, railroad workers, and miners, a rough environment where vulnerability was dangerous. It was in this context that she learned to act masculine, to swear and to drink, not as an act of feminist rebellion, but as a defense mechanism, an armor to protect herself in a world that exploited women like her. Thus, the true foundation of Calamity Jane was not built on innate talent and bravery, but on trauma, abandonment, and desperation. The woman who emerged from this brutal childhood was a survivor, but also a deeply wounded soul. Her tough exterior hid the insecurity of an illiterate orphan, and her later reputation for drinking and causing trouble can be seen as a direct consequence of a youth devoid of stability or affection. The need to invent a new identity, a larger-than-life persona, may have been her only way to psychologically escape the pain and insignificance of her origins. The legend was not born from heroic deeds, but from the necessity of surviving an unbearable reality. At the heart of the Calamity Jane legend beats the epic love story with James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. Popular fiction immortalized them as the most iconic and dangerous couple of the West. They were portrayed as equals. He, the prince of gunslingers, quick-witted and deadly accurate. She, his female counterpart, the only woman wild enough to capture his heart. The stories told of long rides through the Black Hills, deep conversations under starry skies, and a partnership forged in mutual respect and shared danger. The image was one of a destined love, a union as wild and authentic as the frontier itself. This tragic romance, culminating in his death and her supposed revenge, was not just a chapter in her life, it was the event that defined her entire existence in popular culture. Historical reality, however, completely erases this romantic painting, replacing it with a brief and indifferent sketch. Martha Canary and Wild Bill Hickok met in the summer of 1876 when they both arrived in the town of Deadwood, South Dakota, within days of each other. Their association, far from being a years-long romance, lasted only a few weeks. More importantly, Hickok was not an available man in search of a wild love. He was a newlywed who had left his new bride, Agnes Thatcher Lake, in Cheyenne, promising to return after making his fortune in the gold mines. Eyewitness accounts suggest that Hickok, a man notoriously meticulous about his appearance and reputation, saw Martha as little more than a pathetic figure, a loud and often drunk camp follower whose company he tolerated but did not seek. If there was no romance, why did the story become so central to Jane's myth? The answer seems to lie in a mixture of one-sided infatuation and calculated opportunism on her part. After Hickok's murder on August 2, 1876, Martha Canary, who until then had been a relatively obscure figure, saw an opportunity. By proclaiming herself the great love and grieving partner of the now legendary gunman, she instantly elevated her own status. Hickok's death gave her a platform. She began telling stories about her old pal Bill, tales that grew grander and more intimate with each retelling. It was an identity that gave her importance and distinguished her from other poor frontier women. The obsession, whether real or fabricated, became her ticket to immortality. The final and most convincing piece of the myth, her burial next to Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery, is perhaps the cruelest truth of all. Decades after Hickok's death, when Jane died in 1903, she was indeed buried in the adjacent plot. However, this was not the fulfillment of a final romantic wish, but rather a posthumous practical joke. The men who buried her, old-timers who knew both Jane's temperament and Hickok's dislike for her, decided it would be a great final prank on the old gunman. They figured that Hickok, a man who didn't drink and who prized his reputation, would hate to spend eternity next to the woman he considered an alcoholic troublemaker. Thus, the greatest symbol of their eternal love is, in fact, the final proof of the great distance that always existed between them. The image of Calamity Jane with a rifle in hand is as iconic as that of Wild Bill Hickok with his revolvers. The legends painted her as a sentinel of justice, a sharpshooter whose skill was almost supernatural. Stories circulated about her single-handedly defending a stagecoach against bandits, participating in battles alongside soldiers, and being so respected that her mere presence in a camp was enough to deter wrongdoers. In the dime novels, she was the quintessential action heroine, a woman who resolved conflicts not with words, but with the speed of her draw and the precision of her aim. This reputation as a pistolera gunslinger was fundamental to her persona, as a woman who not only survived but dominated the violent, masculine environment of the frontier. However, when searching for concrete evidence to support this fame, one finds a resounding void. There is not a single reliable, verified eyewitness account of Martha Canary participating in a gunfight. There are no official military records proving her service as a scout for General Custer or any other Army unit. While she certainly owned guns and knew how to use them, an essential skill for anyone, man or woman, living on the frontier, there is nothing to suggest she possessed exceptional expertise. The truth is that Calamity Jane's reputation as a gunslinger appears to be built entirely on the stories she told about herself and the fictions that others wrote about her, without any basis in actual deeds. Even the origin of her famous nickname, Calamity Jane, is shrouded in contradiction, pitting her heroic version against the more likely and grim reality. In her autobiography, she claimed to have received the name from an army captain she saved during a battle, who explained she was a heroine for warding off calamity. However, accounts from her contemporaries offer far less flattering explanations. One popular theory was that any man who became romantically involved with her soon found himself in the midst of a calamity, be it a bar fight or financial trouble. Another version suggests the name was a sarcastic commentary on her own life, marked by misfortune and disaster, much of it self-inflicted due to alcoholism. The name, therefore, may not have been a badge of honor, but a brand of her tragic reputation. In reality, Martha Canary's public persona in towns like Deadwood was not that of a silent, deadly guardian, but rather that of a loud, eccentric character. She was known for her excessive drinking, for telling exaggerated stories in saloons in exchange for drinks, and for wearing men's clothing. This latter trait, while seen as a sign of her warrior nature, was likely a much more practical and economical choice than a statement of combat readiness. Her notoriety came from being a character, a woman who shockingly broke social norms, not from any proven skill as a vigilante. The gun she carried was more of a prop for the role she played than a tool of her supposed trade. The transformation of Martha Canary, a poor and anonymous frontier woman, into the iconic Calamity Jane did not happen by accident. It was the result of a perfect storm between personal necessity and the voracious appetite of 19th century popular culture. As the Wild West began to be tamed, the American public, especially in the industrialized East, developed an insatiable thirst for stories about this mythical land. They didn't want the raw truth of poverty, disease, and daily struggle. They wanted heroes, villains, and grand adventures. In this environment, the line between journalism and entertainment was virtually non-existent, and publishers and writers quickly realized that a good story sold far better than a tedious fact. The legend of Calamity Jane was born in this fertile ground, cultivated by two powerful and interconnected forces, her own self-promotion and sensationalist fiction. The first engine of this legend was Martha herself. In 1896, in an attempt to earn some money from her growing notoriety, she dictated a short autobiographical pamphlet titled Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by herself. This booklet was not an honest memoir, but a carefully constructed work of fiction, a piece of personal marketing. In it, she portrayed herself as a brave orphan who became an Army scout, a participant in numerous battles against Native Americans, and the heroine who tracked down and captured Wild Bill Hickok's killer. Every sentence was calculated to build the image of a fearless and heroic figure. Being illiterate, she simply narrated the story she wanted to be true, a version of her life where she was the protagonist of a great adventure, not a victim of circumstance. The second and more powerful engine was the dime novels. These cheap, mass-produced publications were the action movies of their time, delivering thrilling stories to millions of readers. Writers like Edward Lytton Wheeler discovered the figure of Calamity Jane and saw in her limitless potential. They plucked her from her real context and inserted her into a fictional universe, often as the partner of the fictional hero Deadwood Dick. In these stories, Calamity Jane was a superhero. She could track anyone, outshoot any man, and always fought on the side of justice. The authors of these novels had no interest in the real Martha Canary. They were creating a brand-name character, and the success was tremendous, solidifying the fictional version of Jane in the national consciousness far more permanently than any truth. The result was a symbiotic and ultimately destructive relationship. The dime novels made the name Calamity Jane famous across the country, and this fame, in turn, gave the real Martha Canary a way to make a living. She began to embody the character that had been created for her. When tourists and journalists sought her out in Deadwood, expecting to find the heroine from the books, she gave them the show they wanted. She told her tall tales, showed off her guns, and behaved in a rough, wild manner. She became trapped in a cycle. The legend brought her notoriety and the chance to earn a free drink. But to keep the legend alive, she had to increasingly erase the real woman with all her vulnerabilities and sorrows. The performance became her reality and her prison. Con certeza. Abandonamos agora o palco da lenda para entrar nos bastidores sombrios de sua vida real. 6. A Muller por trás da fachada. Analfabetismo, alcoholismo y maternidad cuando a performance de Calamity Jane terminaba y Martha Canary ficaba. A sós con sus pensamientos, a realidad que enfrentaba, era desoladora. Lunge da figura autoconfiante y astuta da lenda, Martha era funcionalmente analfabeta. Essa incapacidade de ler e escrever em um mundo cada vez mais burocrático a deixava em uma posição de extrema vulnerabilidade, dependente de honestidade de outros para entender contratos, cartas ou notícias. Mais devastador ainda era o seu alcoholismo crônico e severo. A imagem do herói do oeste que vivia socialmente era uma fantasia. Para Martha, o álcool não era acessório, mas uma donca debilitante. Era o combustível para suas explosões plicas e a causa de sua constante instabilidade. Uma forma de automédica gale contra uma vida de traumas que apenas se aprofundava ainda mais no abismo do desespero. A vida de Martha era ciclo vicioso de pobreza e humilhaco, perpetuado por sua dependência. Embora sua fama pudesse, por vezes, garantir-lhe uma bebida ou uma refeição paga por admirador, ela era incapaz de manter emprego estável. Foi repetidamente contratada e demitida de diversos trabalhos, desde cozinheira e lavadeira, por ser considerada pouco confiável. Em muitas cidades ela não era vista como uma lenda viva, mas como uma bebida problemática, frequentemente expulsa de saloons e até mesmo da cidade. No entanto, em meio a essa escuridão, surgiam vislumbres de uma humanidade profunda. Durante surto de variola em Deadwood, por exemplo, relatos indicam que ela, imune e donca, cuidou incansavelmente dos dons com uma compaixão que contradizia sua reputação rude, revelando a mulher complexa e contraditória que existia por baixo da caricatura. Talvez o segredo mais doloroso da vida de Martha Canary, completamente apagado de sua lenda heroica, tenha sido a maternidade. Evidências históricas, incluindo cartas e testemunhos, sugerem fortemente que ela deu à luz uma filha em 1887. Longe de ser uma fonte de alegria, essa experiência parece ter sido uma fonte de profunda angústia. Incapaz de prover ambiente, Estavo devido a sua pobreza e a su alcoholismo, Martha foi forcada a dar a criança para atacar. A dor de abandonar sua própria filha e contraponto devastador a imagem da mulher livre e independente que não precisava de ninguém. Esse fardo secreto adiciona uma camada de tragédia a sua história, sugerindo que a mulher que o mundo via como uma aventureira destemida erge, em particular, uma me de qualquer partido. Compreendendo esses fatos, a persona de Calamity Jane pode ser vista sob uma nova luz, não como uma identidade de padre, mas como uma armadura. A figura barulhenta que a Bíblia xingava e contava histórias fantásticas era mecanismo de defesa construído para proteger a vulnerável Martha Canary. Era mais fácil ser a caricatura que todos esperavam do que enfrentar a realidade de ser uma órfã analfabeta, uma alcoólatra sem esperança e uma me que havia perdido sua filha. A lenda se tornou sua máscara e sua prisão, papel que ela tinha que desempenhar para sobreviver, mas que também a impedia de confrontar seus demônios ou buscar uma vida diferente. O custo humano do mito foi o sacrifício da mulher real, que viveu e morreu à sombra de sua própria fique, o dat, começou em declínio, e a fama se tornando fardo. Como foram os últimos dias da mulher que encarnou uma lenda? Qual foi o último ato desesperado de Calamity Jane para capitalizar sua história? E como a dura realidade de seu fim contrastou com o final glorioso que os dime novels teriam escrito para ela? English Translation 6. The Woman Behind the Facade. Illiteracy, alcoholism, and motherhood when the performance of Calamity Jane was over, and Martha Canary was left alone with her thoughts. The reality she faced was bleak. Far from the self-confident and cunning figure of legend, Martha was functionally illiterate. This inability to read and write in an increasingly bureaucratic world left her in a position of extreme vulnerability, dependent on the honesty of others to understand contracts, letters, or news. Even more devastating was her severe and chronic alcoholism. The image of the hard-drinking Western hero was a fantasy. For Martha, alcohol was not an accessory, but a debilitating disease. It was the fuel for her public outbursts and the cause of her constant instability, a form of self-medication against a lifetime of trauma that only pulled her deeper into the abyss of despair. Martha's life was a vicious cycle of poverty and humiliation, perpetuated by her addiction. While her fame could sometimes secure her a drink or a meal paid for by an admirer, she was unable to hold down a steady job. She was repeatedly hired and fired from various jobs, from cook to laundress, for being unreliable. In many towns, she was not seen as a living legend, but as a troublesome drunk, frequently kicked out of saloons, and even run out of town. Yet amidst this darkness, glimpses of a profound humanity emerged. During a smallpox outbreak in Deadwood, for instance, accounts indicate that she, being immune to the disease, tirelessly cared for the sick with a compassion that contradicted her rough reputation, revealing the complex and contradictory woman who existed beneath the caricature. Perhaps the most painful secret of Martha Canary's life Completely erased from her heroic legend was her motherhood. Historical evidence, including letters and testimonies, strongly suggests she gave birth to a daughter in 1887. Far from being a source of joy, this experience appears to have been a source of deep anguish. Unable to provide a stable environment, due to her poverty and alcoholism, Martha was forced to give the child up for adoption. The pain of abandoning her own daughter is a devastating counterpoint to the image of the free, independent woman who needed no one. This secret burden adds a layer of tragedy to her story, suggesting that the woman the world saw as a fearless adventurer was, in private, a heartbroken mother. Understanding these facts, the persona of Calamity Jane can be seen in a new light, not as an identity of power, but as armor. The loud, drinking, swearing figure who told fantastic stories was a defense mechanism built to protect the vulnerable Martha Canary. It was easier to be the caricature everyone expected than to face the reality of being an illiterate orphan, a hopeless alcoholic, and a mother who had lost her child. The legend became her mask and her prison, a role she had to play to survive, but one that also prevented her from ever confronting her demons or seeking a different life. The human cost of the myth was the sacrifice of the real woman who lived and died in the shadow of her own fiction. At the end of the 19th century, the Wild West no longer existed as a real frontier, but survived as a spectacle. Figures like Buffalo Bill Cody transformed their experiences into hugely successful entertainment, creating the Wild West shows that traveled the world. For an aging and impoverished Martha Canary, this was the last opportunity to capitalize on the legend that was both her creation and her curse. In 1901, she was hired to perform at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The idea was that the public could see an authentic Western heroine in the flesh. For Martha, it was a chance to earn desperately needed money and, perhaps, to find a place in a world that was leaving her behind. It was her final bet on the persona of Calamity Jane. However, the stage proved to be a cruel place for a decaying legend. The audience that paid to see the Calamity Jane of the dime novels, the young, fearless sharpshooter, was met instead by a woman in her late 40s, visibly worn down by alcohol and a hard life. Her performances, which were supposed to be shooting demonstrations and retellings of her adventures, often devolved into incoherent, drunken ramblings. Her alcoholism, once a part of her wild charm in the saloons of Deadwood, was unacceptable in the professional environment of a major show. She was fired for drunkenness and disorderly conduct, a public humiliation that proved that even in the world of entertainment, where her legend was born, there was no longer a place for the real woman. After the humiliating failure at the exposition, Martha returned to the Black Hills of South Dakota, the setting of her most notorious days. But she did not return as a heroine coming home. She returned as an anachronistic figure, a relic of a time that had already passed. Her final years were marked by extreme poverty and rapidly declining health. She wandered from town to town, working as a laundress or a cook in brothels, depending on the charity and nostalgia of old acquaintances who remembered her from decades past. The woman the nation knew as an independent adventurer was, in reality, living her last days in complete destitution, a shadow of the self-sufficient figure she and the popular press had created. The end for Martha. Canary came on August 1st, 1903. In a manner as unglamorous as her real life, she was aboard a train on her way to Terry, South Dakota, when she became gravely ill. Taken to a hotel, a doctor diagnosed her with an inflammation of the bowels and pneumonia, conditions exacerbated by years of alcoholism. She died the next day at the age of 51. There was no final gunfight, no heroic last stand, no ending worthy of a legend. It was the quiet, sad end to a life marked by struggle. Her burial next to Wild Bill Hickok was the final act that sealed her place in myth, ensuring that the fiction of her life would forever overshadow the truth of her death. The death of Martha Canary in 1903 should have been the end of her story. Instead, it was the beginning of her immortality. Despite the overwhelming historical evidence that debunks nearly every aspect of her legend, the figure of Calamity Jane, the fearless heroine, remains more alive than ever in popular culture. The reason for this persistence is that the idea of Calamity Jane is far more necessary and appealing than the reality of Martha Canary. The legend fills a cultural void, personifying the timeless archetype of the rebel who lives by her own rules. In a society, both hers and ours, that imposes strict norms, especially on women, the fantasy of a figure who rejects all conventions is irresistibly powerful. The factual truth of Martha's life is tragic and uncomfortable. The myth of Calamity Jane is liberating and inspiring, and culture almost always favors the story that makes us feel stronger. For many, Calamity Jane has become a proto-feminist icon, although the real Martha Canary was not fighting for equal rights, but rather for her next meal. The legend that enveloped her became a symbol of female empowerment. The image of a woman in buckskin pants, competing with and besting men in their own arenas, be it shooting, riding, or drinking, offered a radically different model from submissive Victorian femininity. She represents total autonomy, free from husbands, free from corsets, free from the expectations of society. The legend of Calamity Jane gave generations of women a glimpse of what life could be like without gender restrictions. This symbolic power is so potent that the truth of her motivations becomes secondary to what her image has come to represent. Furthermore, the story of Calamity Jane is a quintessential American myth of self-invention. Her life exemplifies the idea that in America you can be who you say you are. Martha Canary, born into poverty and obscurity, transformed herself through sheer force of narrative into one of the most famous figures of her era. Her story is a microcosm of how the Wild West itself was mythologized. The complex and often brutal real history of expansion was smoothed over and transformed into a tale of adventure and clearly defined heroes and villains. By embracing the legend of Calamity Jane, we also embrace this larger narrative about America, a place where identity is fluid and greatness can be fabricated from humble beginnings. Even if that fabrication is a lie. In the end, the legacy of Calamity Jane is twofold. On one hand, we have the enduring legend, the fictional character who continues to inspire movies, books, and endless fascination. On the other, we have the moving, true story of Martha Canary, which serves as a cautionary tale about the human cost of fame and the brutality of life for an unprotected woman on the frontier. Perhaps the most important legacy lies precisely in the tension between these two poles. Her story forces us to question how history is written, how celebrities are made, and why we crave heroes to the point that we are willing to overlook the flawed humanity behind the mask. The truth about Calamity Jane does not diminish her cultural stature. Instead, it makes her an infinitely more complex and relevant figure, a mirror reflecting both the lies we tell ourselves and the truths we choose to ignore.